What's up guys? Today's video is part 2 of our close reading of a literary text written by Gloria Anzaldúa. I highly suggest that you watch part 1 of this video and I'll put a link to that in the description below. Just a quick note before we start, this text is meant for older readers since it deals with mature themes and it does include some profanity. This video is meant for high school students and above, so please keep this in mind before choosing to watch. Just like in my last video, I'm giving you a chance to pause here and read over the text on your own, then you can resume to see my annotations. So I've highlighted the beginning phrases of these consecutive sentences to show that the author uses a parallel structure to emphasize the reason why she writes. Each sentence shows that the author writes as a form of self-reflection, and she writes to foster a sense of self-acceptance. This is not only an internal monologue that is going on in the author's mind, but it is also an external monologue to convince other third world women writers that what they have to say is valuable. Before, we saw how language is used as an enemy of minorities. In these two underlined passages, language is portrayed as a tool that helps women of color reflect on their own identities. Throughout the letter, the author uses the words we or us to include an entire community of third world women writers. But the use of the first person in these passages is especially important because the author is showing that writing is an act of survival for women of color as a collective. The author also describes an internal conflict between the other within women of color, or the characteristics that make them different from the rest of society, and the voice inside women of color that is trying to convince them to conform. This is a classic example of the man versus self conflict in literature, or perhaps we should say woman versus self. Next, the author includes one of her own journal entries to defy the linear structure of most writing. She writes a mini love letter to her pen in order to explain her appreciation of the art of writing itself and to add a bit of humor. This passage shows that life and writing are often inseparable, so women of color can weave their own experiences, such as their daily routines, directly into their writing. The following paragraph shows that many women of color writers feel too intimidated to write because their own experiences are deemed not important enough. However, the author warns against this, stating that no topic is too trivial to be put down on paper. When the author writes, forget the room of one's own, write in the kitchen, lock yourself up in the bathroom, she's criticizing the author Virginia Woolf's essay, A Room of One's Own, which argues for a physical and figurative space for women to write. Anzaldúa argues that many women of color don't have the privilege of having a space in which they can write by themselves, for example, a separate room in their home. So Woolf's essay excludes third world women writers. Instead, Anzaldúa says that women of color should write whenever and wherever they can. You can pause this video now, and I'm going to get started. Again, I've circled the instances in which the author addresses her audience directly with the phrases mujeres de color, women of color, and mujer mágica, magical woman. As we saw in part 1 of this video, these phrases are examples of direct appeals that showcase the author's bilingual identity. In the section I've highlighted, the author describes herself cutting and pasting words together on the floor. This is a symbolic act of piecing together her own fragmented identity. Next, the author includes a simile comparing fear to a magnet. This magnet draws out the memories and ideas that women of color are most afraid to discuss, and empowers them to talk about these things. Writing is also compared to a relentless tiger or demon. As we've seen throughout the text, writing is described either as a tool or an enemy, and here it is described as both. Although the act of writing is constantly plaguing writers, it is a necessary force that compels them to write the truth. Writing is also dangerous to oppressors and the subjects of oppression. On one hand, writing reveals the ugly truth of oppression and scapegoating, but on the other hand, women of color who write are faced with the prospect of retaliation. This next part conveys an important theme. The author suggests that organic writing occurs when a poem uncovers an idea or theme that the author herself didn't necessarily intend to convey. Thus, the poem is both the discoverer and the discoveree. In this quote, Kathy Kendall alludes to Audre Lorde, a famous black, lesbian, feminist, writer, and civil rights activist who explored different aspects of her identity, similar to Gloria Anzaldúa. This reference reminded me of one of Audre Lorde's essays titled The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, in which she writes, "Your silence will not protect you." That statement, I think, effectively summarizes the main points of this text too. Leave your thoughts in the comments down below and tell me what you think this idea, "your silence will not protect you," means. Now we've reached the last few paragraphs of this letter, so you can pause here and I'm going to get started. When the author writes that words wither in ivory towers and in college classrooms, she's saying that these secluded scholarly institutions are actually tools of the oppressor because they're places of escape where individuals fail to tackle real-world topics with depth and critical thinking. Moreover, the author juxtaposes or contrasts the idea of the tangible and the abstract. The tangible means concrete images or words that readers can understand clearly, and the author argues that women of color should focus on these kinds of concrete ideas to reach as many people as possible. Blood and pus and sweat are representations of the genuine struggles of women of color, which will ultimately have more of an impact on readers due to the personal nature of these stories. Finally, the author repeats the idea of the sellout, which we saw in one of her references earlier to La Vendida in the previous video. Basically, the author wants women of color writers to know that they should not conform for the sake of fame, recognition, or social acceptance. Instead, they should be true to themselves. In the comments, I'd love to hear your answers to these questions. What are your thoughts on the structure of the piece? Why do you think the author chose to write it in the form of a letter? As always, remember to like, subscribe, and tap the bell to receive notifications whenever I make a new video. See you next time!